can get started. We'll see if more people roll in during the introduction. But yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar, both the panelists, the speakers, and the participants. My name is Ola Adag. I'm a policy analyst at Open Forum Europe in Brussels. And on behalf of the All Pros EU team, thank you for joining the webinar. So as you know, the title is Unveiling the Open Source Silicon Landscape, a cutting-edge approach for the European semiconductor industry. Quite a mouthful. And we're very happy to have you here and talk all things open silicon. So before we dive in, I just wanted to briefly introduce the project. So All Pros EU is a coordination and support action which is funded by the European Commission under the Digital Europe program. It is jointly coordinated by 4 companies: Open Forum Europe, Trust IT, IDC, and White Research. And together we're running this project. It's turning 1 in January, which is very exciting. And the whole thing is set to last 3 years. So if you want to know more about our events, webinars, research, everything that we do, you can check out our website, allpros.eu. So yeah, just a quick FYI, we will be recording this webinar, and we will share the recording afterwards on our YouTube channel and our project's website. So now that we have the announcements out of the way, I think we can move on with our agenda. As you can tell, we have a pretty packed schedule ahead of us. Unfortunately, the opening speech, which was supposed to be given by Matthew Zuareb from the European Commission, will not be happening. He could sadly not join us today, but instead we have, I hope, an equally exciting opening presentation by Sergei Andreev from the Leibniz Institute for High Performance Microelectronics over in Frankfurt. And he will give us a brief introduction into the work that his team is doing in the open PDK space. So yeah, I think Sergei, you can take it away.
Hello, my name is Sergei Andreev. I joined IHP to work on the open source PDK development, and I will give you a brief introduction to IHP and the short overview of the current status of PDK development. So let me share. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So HP stands for Institute for High Performance Microelectronics. It's a German research and innovation center for silicon-based systems, radio frequency and technologies. Research focuses on socially relevant topics such as communication, mobility, health, and environment, industry and agriculture, sustainability and security. It's famous for the silicon germanium heterojunction bipolar transistor and BiCMOS. This technology targets frequencies and data rates which are out of reach of state-of-the-art CMOS. IHP's unique selling point is 200 millimeters pilot line for state-of-the-art BiCMOS technologies, operated under industry-oriented conditions 24/7 and for the provision of the prototypes and small batches. We have 3 technologies in the 130 nanometers nodes, and from these 3 we choose the second generation SG13G2 as already qualified and robust enough for the development of an open source PDK. Now to the main topics of the following slides. I'll start from the motivation, stepping to the open source flows, next to the already available open PDK data and planet updates, and finally coming to the outlook. We started this open source PDK initiative because we want to provide low threshold access to technology, design PDK and tools for the chip designers, technology developers, and academic projects. Want a pipe cleaning to demonstrate possibilities that open source could provide, and also to simplify access to education material for chip designers. The open source PDK development is just a part of the large German-funded FMD Coincy project. The other two parts are design certificate courses and the free MPW runs that we have. What we want to have in the open PDK and open tool development, and what we were based on. We were looking at Skywater project, but we decided that we will look more in the analog design flow and later RF design. The quality should be high enough to fulfill academic education. And we already seen from the beginning that the open source EDA tools must be improved, and the interface development is somewhere lacking. Next, I want to show you is our proposal of the OpenPDK and EDA flow. Here you can see the flow diagram of the already well-known and established open source digital design development flow, the open lane. And here is our proposal of an analog RF OpenPDK flow. We are targeting layout oriented flow, namely layout design, parameterizable cells implementation, and physical verification will be done using layout current functionality or with additional features that will be developed specifically to enable IHP open source PDK flow. As a next step, we will develop magic support, magic oriented flow. For the next item is the data that we already have in place with a highlight on the updates. We have created separate public GitHub repository for the OpenPDK project. We enabled settings, additional settings to comply with the GitHub community standards like code of conduct, contributor sign-off with the developer certificate of origin. Not only IHP is uploading data to the GitHub repository. Currently, we have several contributors. Also, we have an active communication process using the GitHub issues functionality that helps us update and fix our PDK based on the user's feedback. On the right side of the slide, you can see the current contents of the PDK. We have documentation, various tool-related data, actual cells, basic standard cells with a set of combinational sequential cells. We have SRAM cells as well. We have measurement data, and we have support for the OpenEMS. It's electromagnetic simulation tool. And we are providing with each and every step more and more data to enable the fully workable PDK. This is the latest update that we had so far. We provided XCAM symbols and test benches, simulation models for all our active and passive devices. And we have now minimal rule set for the layout GRC checks. Here you can find some details about the XCAM symbol library for our primitive devices. The support for simulation is enabled as well. And here you can see the structure and some details about what we have. An example of what will look like the DRC run in K layout on a PDS test structure. And yes, for the next steps, we are working towards finalizing the IO cells development. Progress on the K layout API for Pi cells is ongoing also, and we still are developing the CookSys support for our schematic capture. LVS is ongoing, and we plan to add support for the Coriolis automatic flow. Open PDK P cells, we already have Synopsys Pi cells that are basically our own cadence skill P cells converted using PyStudio to Pi cell API. What we want to have in our Open PDK are the Python P cells written with K-layout API, which will have the same layout, and well, we target the same functionality as well. And here you can see the P cell parameters for the CMIN device and MOS transistor. Coming to the outlook, the roadmap is what we see currently is the following, that we should agree on common goals for design flow, to synchronize efforts and tasks, to review and update our project schedule. At the end, we will need to demonstrate successful open source design and design training courses. And as a goal, we'll have a commercial successful project. The first phase target is to submit digital design based on open source PDK in December of this year. In yellow, you can see the activities that are still in progress, but we hope that we will manage to finish them. And that's all for the quick overview of our status.
Thanks.
So thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Sergey, so much for doing this introductory presentation. As you can tell, a lot of the elements that we'll be covering in our panel discussion shortly will probably come up time and time again. And I think one of the ways here is the importance of collaboration and the importance of the educational element of
Yes.
silicon solutions in the semiconductor chain in Europe. So thank you so much for that. And now, if I can pull up my screen, I will share my presentation, which is the overview of a policy brief that we prepared over at Open Forum Europe as part of our work for All Pros. If you can see my screen, that would be great. Great. So yeah, the policy brief that we are presenting here is the open source silicon's position in the semiconductor value chain in Europe. And we are kind of zooming out of what Sergey was just presenting on the specific issue of open PDK solutions and looking at the broader implications of what open silicon means for the value chain of semiconductor industry in Europe. So with our policy brief, we wanted to explore the role of open silicon in the semiconductor research and development, as well as the industrial integration in Europe. And we started out by sketching out the position that its plays and relationships that it has with other domains in the semiconductor value chain. So to do that, we used strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis of open source silicon and looked at the implications for Europe. And we did this through targeted research, interviews with experts, actually some of whom will be joining us for the panel right after this, and through our engagements in the All Pros EU stakeholder plan. And those included webinars as well as targeted workshops. So as a general kind of conclusion, we can say that we see a significant role that the open silicon plays in education and innovation. And we see a large potential for higher level integrations as well. At the same time, we do acknowledge in our research that there is a problem with maturity of some of the solutions, and we'll go into a little more detail about this shortly. And as part of our conclusions, we presented a set of recommendations that can help to leverage strategic openness in the European semiconductor supply chain and to use open silicon as a part of the EU chip sovereignty efforts. So to start with, why open source silicon in the first place? What was the aim of this research? We wanted to underline the interactions between open source hardware and software and how those create new openings in this highly interdependent sector. As you all probably know, the semiconductor value chain is full of very intricate and delicate relationships between different suppliers and producers and designers. And open silicon can play a really big role in leveraging those relationships to the betterment of the semiconductor value chain. So essentially, when we talk about open source silicon, what we mean is a set of different design architectures, standards, IP cores, as well as pieces of software that together play an important role in the chip design process of the semiconductor chain. And it's still a nascent field. There's still a lot to be done. And as we'll go into more detail, we'll see that there's still some maturity issues here. But we can say that historically, Europe has had a very strong base in equipment, chemicals, and the research part of the semiconductor value chain. And there's still some openings here to be leveraged when it comes to open silicon. And we see that there's a way for the European chips suppliers, producers, and designers, and for them to get ahead of this open silicon curve that is rising. And we can already see this in places outside of Europe, where open silicon and open silicon solutions are playing a much larger role, for example, in China or in Brazil. So we're hoping that with this research, we can chart the road ahead and see how open silicon can help the European semiconductor players rise to the top. So just to kind of briefly give you an overview of some of the things we looked at, we considered those three aspects, which are the maturity of solutions, their profitability, and the relevance for education and skills as the most important aspects of what really matters when we're talking about different domains within the value chain. And I just highlighted two of them here, and those are the open ISAs and the open EDA tools. And we got a really nice introduction into the open PDK space with Sergei's presentation as well, so I will not be touching on that. And I just wanted to highlight these two as a sort of good reference point and a good overview of what having strong open players means for different domains along the supply chain. As you can probably guess, the high scores in the ISA field here are largely attributable to the existence of RISC-V and the open standards that come with it, and the fact that um, the license and royalty-free nature of this solution allows both software and hardware engineers to collaborate and to produce new innovative solutions in the space. And those also include the low power processing and high performance computing solutions. So we have a wide variety of applications with a high level of customization, and this directly contributes to the relevance that the open ISA has for education and skills, because it can be used in academic settings to train future generations of designers, and it can really help with uplifting this part of the value chain. And then as a sort of counterpoint to this, for open EDA tools, we can say that there's a much lower level of maturity of those solutions. They also offer great educational applications, but unfortunately, they still mostly focus on modeling design rather than the physical design aspects. And that means that the physical design processes are still highly reliant on proprietary software. And those, as you probably know, are the oligopoly sort of softwares that are created by American companies. So this creates a certain setback for the European industry, and shows us that there's room for improvement in different parts of the sector. So moving on to the actual analysis, I just plucked some of the most interesting threats and opportunities that we identified in our research that I think are important to highlight here. And I will start with the threats because those are a little bit more upsetting, I would say, and then I would move on to the opportunities to see that there's still ways that we can chart the road ahead of us and uplift the European semiconductor industry. So starting off with the kind of elephant in the room, which is the low number of women in the sector. And this, I would say, is a compounding factor, and it is directly related to the fact that open silicon, as I mentioned before, exists at the intersection of the open source and open hardware movements, and with the semiconductor industry at play as well, which means that the problems from both of those domains kind of play off of each other in this space. And I don't have the numbers up on the screen, but in our research, we showed that when it comes to the semiconductor industry, around 12 to 14% of the positions in, I would say, power or like just higher up positions in the semiconductor industry belong to women. And then when it comes to the open source communities, women are severely underrepresented and constitute something between 4 to 14% of the members of the communities there. So we definitely see room for improvement, and we can definitely say that we are missing out on a lot of innovation and possibly talent and new solutions because of the lack of women in the field. Then moving on to the failure to build a critical mass in open source hardware and open silicon. This is a threat that I assume is all too familiar to those of you who are part of the open communities. And that is the risk that is always all too present when it comes to maintaining projects and ensuring that developers feel supported, and both financially and emotionally, to contribute to the projects in a sustainable way. We know that there are issues with that sort of support. We know that there is also financial funding issues on the organization side. And we know that if communities aren't incentivized to work and contribute to those projects, we run the risk of having them fail or be unmaintained, and eventually maybe even posing some cybersecurity risks down the line. So the final threat that I will talk about briefly here is the opaque gap between industry and academia. And what we mean by that is despite having a very strong research base in Europe, we see that a lot of the solutions that are produced domestically, let's say, are not being utilized down the supply chain and are not being taken up by European semiconductor companies. So a lot of the solutions that, some of the representatives of those companies are going to be with us in the panel shortly. They can speak to the issue here that there is a lot of strong incentive and research being produced on the academic side, and then we don't really see that translating into the take up by the industry. So now on to the happier part of this slide, which is the opportunities that we've identified with open silicon, and the great things that can happen when we use open silicon in the semiconductor value chain. And the first one is that we can boost the semiconductor R&D in Europe, because of the position that open silicon takes in the open science framework. It combines the best of both worlds when it comes to the support of the open communities and the insights and knowledge of the academic community. So by using open silicon, we can accelerate the development of ideas and novel solutions and help to fill the gaps that persist, especially when it comes to the skills gap that I'm sure will be talked about in our panel shortly. Then the next opportunity that we have identified is the security for transparency. That probably won't be controversial to say here, as most of you work with open solutions and have some experience with that. We know that many stakeholders still associate openness with increased vulnerability. And with this research, wanted to show that this is not the case, or that is not the full picture. And kind of the two things I wanted to highlight is that deployment of open silicon predominantly happens on the chip design side of the value chain. And this stage is characterized by a pretty low risk of national security risks. And that means that a lot of the problems that come up exist across the different solutions, so both open and proprietary. And it's not a specifically open or issue related to transparency that gives rise to them. And yes, the vulnerabilities that exist are mostly related to firmware, and those are present on both sides of this discussion. And we know from other applications as well that more transparency and more openness actually leads to fewer threats and more collaboration on solving them quickly. So this really is, I think, a PR issue that we need to solve within the community, and just to prove and show that there really is a great opportunity in using open solutions. And then finally, we identified this opportunity of a bottom-up industrial reinforcement. And what we mean by that is the idea that because of the inherent interoperability and modularity that comes with open silicon, the European industrial base can actually utilize it to become stronger. We can have SMEs, scale-ups, startups coming into the space and using modular designs and building their own solutions using incremental pieces that can be produced quickly and in a complementary way, so that they won't be bound by a single vendor and bound by high entry-level fees. And instead, they can use their custom IP to create their own solutions using multiple licenses. And this can help with scaling up and also just creating new innovative solutions. So for the last part, I'll just briefly cover this because I think this will be better to be discussed during our panel. But the policy brief concludes with some recommendations for what can be done to address the threats and the opportunities that were identified here. And I think there's no surprise here that the number one recommendation is more funding and more resources that are needed to support the open silicon solutions at the European research institutes. We have representatives from those institutes in our panel, and we saw from Sergey's presentation as well that collaboration can happen, but it cannot be facilitated without funding. And most of that funding usually has to come from governments who can galvanize enough support to give money to those innovative projects. The second one is a no-brainer. It would be great if we managed to encourage more women to enter into STEM subjects academically and then to stay in those subjects in their later careers. We briefly outlined some solutions, and we mostly see the institutional and organizational problems that stand in the way of greater female representation in the field, especially in the open silicon field. So we recommend specific trainings and institutional solutions that can ensure that women are excited and encouraged to go into STEM. Then we have the idea of regulatory sandboxes, which can be used to release open PDK and open EDA tools for educational purposes, so that we can close the skills gap that exists in the semiconductor industry, and we can ensure that the future generation of both academics and practitioners actually have a space and an opportunity to practice with those tools, because we see that the high licensing costs are a huge problem, not just for the companies, but also for academic and research institutions who don't have access to the tools that they need to train the future generations. Then we have the support and investment in more legal certainty for open silicon at SMEs and startups, and also companies more broadly. We know that the complicated IP processes and the amount of legal documentation that is required to run fab or a foundry pose a lot of entry level barriers to for companies in Europe, so that investing and supporting the kind of administrative side as well is crucial to ensuring that open silicon is taken up by SMEs and startups on the continent. And then again, highlighting the kind of obvious point here that security through transparency, not obscurity, is the way to go. We saw this in the open source software space that is much more mature than the open source hardware space. And we see how collaboration and openness ensure better solutions and quicker responses to security and risk vulnerabilities in the space. And then finally, we call for more funding for research projects which are focused on innovation and developments in the open silicon sector. Kind of ties in with the first point here that there is a lot of potential in this space, but because it is still a bit not as mature and unexplored, research should be done with funding that can really elevate this space in the future. So those are my main points. I think that, or I hope that I managed to convey the message of the policy brief and present the main ideas that we discussed there. I don't think that there's a need for any other follow-ups right now, so we can just move straight into our panel discussion. For the panel, we have a quite large group of great researchers and practitioners from across the value chain, representing both the open silicon and semiconductor industry here. So I can just go around and give you guys a quick round of introductions, if you don't mind. We can start with Teresa Garcia, who's the leading research engineer at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. Super excited to have you here. We have Michael Gielda, who's the VP for Business Development at Micro. We have Luca Alotti, who's the president of the Free Silicon Foundation and a practitioner in the open silicon space. We have Matthias Küferlein, who's the open source contributor and founder of K-Layout. Then we have Etienne Walter, who's the general manager at the European Processor Initiative. And finally, last but not least, Philippe Noton, who's the CEO of Cypearl. So really excited to have you here. Thank you for joining me for this panel. And I think we can, dig right in. I have lucked out in having a lot of you be part of the European Processor Initiative. So I think it's only suitable that we start off with this project and chat a little bit more about the implications it has for open silicon, as well as the progress and where you stand. So maybe Etienne, if you want to take it away, could you just brief us on the state of play with regards to EPI, how your work is progressing, how's your collaboration, and just give us a taste of what it's like.
Okay, thank you, Ola, for this introduction. Maybe first a quick disclaimer. So I'm paid by Eviden, so I'm an employee of Eviden. And as you said, I'm a general manager of European Processor Initiative. So I have maybe two hats, one being industry representative for Eviden, and the other one being this European Processor Initiative project representative. And as you may know, API has two big aims, one being at producing a general purpose processor. And there, Cypearl is really the champion. So I will let Philippe speak more of it. And the other one being a RISC-V accelerator, led, for instance, by ESE. Within the project. So it's great to see progress on those two sides. And regarding the RISC-V accelerators, we have now a new version of test chip that has been produced this year and that has been tested around Europe, I would say, between Greece and Barcelona and other labs now. It's the EPAC 1.5 chip that is being tested. So it runs pretty well at this stage. So it's and it embeds several accelerators, one vector accelerator, one stencil accelerator, etc. So it's a test chip, so it's not big enough to be put in production. It's not at the right technology scale for that, but it's interesting, as we can hear, combine some IPs and see how it works. So that's pretty good, and I'm really glad to see this progress. And just to come on what you may have said in the introduction slide, so it's we have a global effort among industry and academics. So I'm quite glad to coordinate this global effort, and it's sometimes not easy because the dynamics are not the same on the academic side and on the industrial side, and we can see this gap appearing between the academics world and the industrial world, because the motivation are not the same, and by nature the effort are not aimed totally in the same direction. But we can, by the way, have some synergy within the project, and that's really fine. And we have to work, and I think it's a global community effort to make this gap between academics and industry, and also between labs and fab, as mentioned recently by Thierry Breton, as close as possible. And I think this is probably a global purpose we should work on all together.
Absolutely. If you want to add anything else?
No, I can let the turn if others want to add something.
Yeah, Philippe could take it away. Philippe? if you want to
Yeah,
ask.
sorry. I was in mute. So thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks Etienne for what you said. I fully share it. Just to introduce me, so I'm CEO and founder of Cypel. Cypel is a pure private entity. I'm in the semiconductor space for 25 years. And I've set up EPI with Etienne a while ago. I was GM of EPI during 2018 to 2021 for the first phase. So Cypel is the first private entity that I started in EPI. So we develop a super high performance microprocessor. The first chip is in 6 nanometer, so it's beyond, let's say, 150 million euros in terms of budget. And we have started, so this one is in 6 nanometer, and we have started the second one, which is in 3 nanometer. So you can bet that all discussion related to, let's say, open source and open source hardware are interesting for us. Let's say before I continue, you have to know also, to be fully neutral, that I have ARM as investor. So my speech may be a bit yes, because ARM is the champion of, let's say, closed IP. Now, by definition, when you develop a microprocessor, you use lots of open source software, because on top of the processor, you have Linux, you have distribution, you have a BIOS, you need to build compiler, and for us, the compiler are either coming from GCC or LLVM. So let's say working on open source software is really part of the deal. We even have started to contribute to LLVM, so we start to upload some code. So this is definitely part of the deal. Now we use lots of EDA, because when you are designing a product that will have to end on the market, so I mean not a test chip or demonstrator or something like this, so you cannot use your practice license. You need to use commercial license, so you need to pay a lot for these licenses. And in our case, without disclosing any secret, for a startup, we have more than 1 million euros per month of expenses in EDA. It's huge what we have to spend. So if we could move, let's say, later on to an open source EDA, why not? I'll be the first one happy to save this money. Will be probably the case of the discussion later on. I just don't think that for this class of technology, so let's say deep node processes, it will ever happen. I'll be back to this later on. And for the IPs also, that's, we have the one we develop ourselves, we have the one that we had to license, and especially coming from ARM, which today are not really, let's say, open source hardware. But I'll be happy to come back to this later.
Does anyone from the more pro open silicon side want to speak up and answer to Philippe's arguments?
Maybe I can comment on the EDA part. I mean, usually the argument is cost. Yeah. What Philip actually mentions is yeah, that is a domain. The let's say the high scale or large scale EDA is a domain that's quite unlikely to be covered entirely by open source in the future. So I mean, I personally feel that I'm representing EDA here because as far as I understood, I'm the only one representing an EDA project here. My project is not targeting to become a, let's say, low-cost alternative to commercial solutions. So that's probably not realistic because of many reasons. One of them being the legal aspect, because when it comes to high performance, you're entering a region where you are pretty likely to violate patents and things like that. And this is something that is not really open to open source tools. What I specifically think is attractive for open or in this respect is the SME and the, let's say, not high-end part of the technology. For example, the IHP technology is like it's mature but also aged, and it doesn't provide a complexity or needs a complexity tool-wise that cannot be covered by open source. And this is a niche that is also not attractive for the big EDA vendors. So I hope they will not look too close what we are actually doing here and ask for patent infringement or things like that. So far this was working well. So there's a certain share. Open source has its niche, and honestly, I think it will stay like this unless there is a shift towards, let's say, funding of large-scale solutions, but also security in terms of legal conditions and also licenses. And maybe also the patent situation plays a role here. Maybe Europe can do something here. I'm not sure. Algorithm-wise or implementation-wise, I don't think that's something that cannot be dealt in the open source domain. So the algorithms there, they are pretty well known, and there's a lot of research that can be utilized. Oh, that's my comment on the EDA part.
Yeah, if I may follow up on Matthias said, basically, of course, I don't think anyone ever expects open source to replace everything and all software. In no space whatsoever has this actually happened, meaning that there's always going to be open source and proprietary alternatives. It's just that open source can often more go broader and further because of its kind of collaborative nature. And in fact, it's typically the key players that also deal with proprietary software that stand to benefit from open source. I mean, it's not an either or. It's not a. We shouldn't position this as a combat between open source tools and closed tools. If we can manage to get open source tools into better shape, it's probably the tooling vendors, the current ones that will also benefit very heavily. And I agree, of course, positioning things as a low-cost alternative to something else is just probably missing the point of open source, because the true aspect of open source is the collaboration, the innovation, targeting those niche use cases that otherwise aren't really perhaps profitable to typical business model. So I think there's plenty. I agree, of course, there's plenty of work to be done. But I don't see that this is going to be limited to just small companies and research. This is what happened to open source software, by the way. Like if you go back in time, like 30 years, you will see that people used to say, "Oh yeah, this open source is small and insignificant and only for hobbyists and only for like research people and small companies at best," right? Fast forward to today, and like the largest corporations are sponsoring, building open source in the software space. And of course, hardware still has a long way to go, but at least I am foreseeing, that this paradigm shift will happen. It'll probably take time, more time than it did in software, unfortunately, and that's kind of what we're trying to accelerate. But perhaps commenting on the legal aspects of it, I totally agree, of course, that there's plenty of work in that area. Some of this is trying to be handled as part of groups like Chips Alliance or Open Hardware Group, where many partners come together. They kind of make sure that whatever they build uses the right license. Like Apache comes to mind in terms of like patent protection. Chips Alliance is a legal group that helps in making sure that whatever we do is it doesn't cause trouble further down the road. And it's a drop in the ocean, of course. It's definitely more focus on establishing good legal frameworks around open source hardware are necessary. And of course, like the uncertainty brought about with, like, for example, the CRA that's been proposed in the recent times is also kind of not helping, because people are not sure what to expect. But I believe that the European Union has potentially a huge role to play here in establishing, the right incentives as well as the right kind of methodologies for just encouraging people to freely innovate, right? Because at the end of the day, we don't really want to be thinking, could I innovate here because perhaps someone's going to sue me later? I mean, this is probably not very conducive to to scientific research and development. Okay, I'll stop here to let other people say something.
That was great. Thank you so much. Maybe Teresa, if you want to address the kind of more academic research side of this question.
Yeah, actually, I think it's I agree with my colleagues here. So I don't think right now, at least the ERA tools for silicon can replace the field vendor tools that we have because of the maturity level of things. But I think they are a really good opportunity to training the future engineers and also to bring the gap between industry and research in the way of applying best practices. So bringing best practices to the research institutions and also for educational purposes can help to deal with those difficulties that we already have. As Etienne mentioned, the goals of research are different from industry goals. However, we need to find a way to work in a similar way, at least, to bring those gaps. So I think open source tools are a great vehicle for making that path, and also to contribute to make the process better for industry, because as Michael mentioned, so all the progress that we make in open source can be used for industries to improve their products or their tools or other things. So I think it's an opportunity from research perspective and educational purposes to invest on those and use on those to to have better professionals and the development career development, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe piggybacking off of what you said and what Etienne mentioned earlier with the with regard to the collaboration between institutions that are more academic and more in the industry space. How do you see that collaboration happening in Europe? Have you noticed that there's better take up of open source solutions when the two sides can come together to collaborate? Is there space for improvement? I'm assuming there will be some. But yeah, can you speak to the collaboration from your side?
I mean, I think Europe is doing a great job in that sense, because there are a lot of collaborations between research centers and industries. Actually, we can see not only EPI project, European Processor Initiative project, but also other European projects that have this partnership between research and industrial. So I think we are doing a really good job there. Of course, one of the weaknesses, as I've already mentioned, is the best practices, because the way we work in research is different. Because as researchers, we want to publish papers, and when you have to develop something from the industry perspective, what we need to deliver in a very tight period of time. So we need to implement those best practices that give us the efficiency to improve the way we work. But I think we are making progress on that. And another way to see this is that some of the research that moved to a spin-off. So it's also a good mechanism to make this collaboration between research and industries another mechanism to increase the space. I wanted to mention something else, but well, I think my colleagues can also mention something else. Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone wants to add something.
Yes, just to say that we absolutely need this cooperation. So it does exist, and we have to improve it for sure. But it's something that is absolutely needed because searchers can bring some brilliant ideas, and these ideas have to be turned then into products. So we need the both sides, and we have to work together to make it work as a whole. So that's not a question for me. It's absolutely a need, and it's something good that appears in Europe. And for example, if we look in the past, we had the Mont Blanc project that did enable with BSC also, that did permit to popularize the use of the ARM ISA for HPC. And it was a really great work that has been done, joining academics and industrials. So it was quite a good example of such collaboration. So it is possible. It is not easy because the dynamics are not the same, but it's a real need, I would say, and it works.
Yeah, and perhaps something important is one of the weaknesses perhaps that we have to work on is the standardization, because sometimes when you want to combine different IPs or different IPs or modules or whatever, each one of us has our way to work, and it would be nice to work together on having better standards that make the process of integrating all the different pieces faster and easier.
Absolutely. There's a question in the chat that I think kind of roots into what we're discussing here. Heiko asked if we can pose inquiries. What roles might international corporations play within the European Union's open source semiconductor ecosystems, and which entities or strategies are deemed the most effective entry points for their engagement? So far, we've been talking about kind of the European side of things, European companies collaborating with European research and academic institutions. Is there space and is there ways of collaborating with the bigger international players and bringing some of their best practices into play in Europe?
Yeah. So please.
Okay, just quickly, I mean, this is already happening, right? Like, for example, Global Foundries, involvement in the Open PDK space, and collaborations like CHIPS Alliance or Open 100 Group, again, they don't only involve, European parties. So definitely, of course, there is room for international corporations to collaborate here. Open source is kind of made to enable that. I mean, you can't make European open source. Even if, Europe is super successful in open source, which I hope it will be, without collaboration with other regions of the world, it's definitely not going to be what it could be. And we should definitely encourage that, because open source just enables this free sharing of ideas. This is, of course, especially happening with the States, I think, obviously.
Yes, maybe on two things about cooperation. Cooperation is possible, of course, and we have to do that. We have to be good enough to be able to bring something on the table, to be serious and considered. So we have to have good assets at this point. One important point also is about standardization. It has been mentioned by Teresa. For me, it's quite important before having open source hardware. It is to define, and it's a community effort for that, standards that allows to define the bricks that may be open source. We may imagine to have some open source IP, and it's absolutely fine when we can have that. And in other case, it may not be open source because there can be questions of industrial ownership or big money behind that, because a private investor need to have a return on investment, and everything cannot for sure be open source, at least in the world we know today. But we can certainly imagine to have some mix of open source breaks together with non-open source according to the matter and the place in the game. And certainly this is something to be considered, and standards are a way to permit that.
Absolutely. Philippe, maybe do you want to add anything as a representative of the investor and industry side here?
Yeah, much more industry side than investor, so I'm not investor myself. Yeah, I mean, that's when you're building a chip which will end to a product, so you need to really take care of what you put in the chip. When you have a bugger software or patent infringement in software, you can always think about a software fix that you can download later on. In hardware, when it's gone, so when it's taped out, it's taped out. And there are multiple cases in this industry when the chips are deployed in high volume, and it tends to courts, let's say related, to the big player like Broadcom, Apple, etc. Because there is big volume and big money behind. They're just waiting for the chip to be rolled out in massive volume on the market and to start to sue it, or let's say to sue the product owner due to patent infringement. And today, that's also one of the issues you have. So first, you don't have necessarily access to the same IP in open source mode and in, let's say, closed mode. That's for, let's say, for obvious reason. But when you select an open source IP, you have to manage the risk behind. Because if later on a patent infringement or something like this happens, stolen code or let's say a GPL contamination, you will be the only one to fight for it, and you will have nobody behind you to support it. When you license an IP from a Synopsys, ARM, or other, let's say, players like this, part of the deal, of course, you have to pay them for the service, the IP, and the support, but you take also a very good patent protection. And as we said earlier on, in the computing, which is let's say our ecosystem today, there are thousands of patents. Intel, Apple, Samsung, ARM, they have their own patents. So in terms of risk management, we have to really take care of this. In our cases, it was much more a question of performances than patent. And that's one of the reasons we went to ARM, because it was the only IP available and too complex for us to develop them from scratch. And also two comments on what have been discussed earlier on. We are talking about standards, open standard. There is especially one related to UCI and chiplets, because there we are talking about open source IP, but the market or part of the market will move to chiplets. So it means that you will have multiple stakeholders developing their own chiplets. So this may end to a chiplet marketplace. So you may have some chiplet from, let's say, academic sources, from industrial sources, and after it's up to the product owner to decide which chiplets to implement, following open standard. And I would like also to comment on one point, because you have, let's say, discussed about, let's say, global collaboration. Yes, it has to be done on a worldwide basis. But there is one point which has been raised in US in October, so two months ago, with a Senator, Marco Rubio, that wanted to limit, let's say, the access to open hardware and open source for Russia and China.
Yes.
That's, open source is fair. Everybody can upload it. But today there are some very, very compelling open source IPs that will end in, let's say, computing, and if you follow, let's say, US terms in mass destruction weapon. So that's, let's say, the usual case. But at the end, who is going to take benefits of this? It's also countries which are not necessarily very friendly today.
Yeah.
So that's something we have to assume, because you don't open source. You open source for the full planet. You don't open source for only the, let's say, specific countries. So it's a global target.
Maybe I would like to comment on this, because I think in the domain of IT infrastructure, so Linux is so dominant and it's purely open source. So I think they have basically the same concerns like you. Also with respect to GPL contamination, as you call it, but they solved it by a general openness, I'd say, because when you look at IT frameworks, for example, web frameworks, things like that, they are, I think, with only few exceptions, open source. So everything that happens on the cloud servers, on AWS and things like that, that's basically 99% open source. And big companies like Google and Facebook and Netflix, and they all contribute to this infrastructure. And I don't see anyone being afraid of GPL contamination or supporting evil nations to build something malicious from that. I think this could example to handle this problem. Yeah.
It's not even that there are no concerns, but there are patterns to prevent that. I mean, GPL contamination is one good example where obviously it's just a matter of, how well you maintain your open source code and how well you track the dependencies and so on. And there are already tools and patterns for, everyone wants to avoid GPL. Not everyone, but like people that care about that part of thing, they do want to avoid it, and it's avoidable, and there are tools and methodologies to avoid it if you need to. These are actually two different things, because the problem with foreign entities in kind of problematic areas of the world, let's call it, is a real problem, right? And people are concerned with it. And I'm not going to say there's an obvious solution to it. Like if you share your knowledge freely, it will obviously get to people that you wouldn't want to share them with. At the same time, is a cost versus benefit evaluation where the innovation of doing open development just outweighs the problems that it creates, and still in many areas, as Matthias mentioned, in many areas of human activity, people have done this evaluation of risk versus benefit and decided that open source is actually very useful, worthwhile, and inducive to innovation. So kind of hardware will probably have to transition, go through the same kind of debate and discussion and try to figure out ways to handle these things well. But ultimately, I mean, they can be handled. We do have examples from other domains.
I guess to speak to the comments you made about foreign entities and the dangers and kind of opportunities that come from that collaboration, there is this constant tension between European Union's efforts of achieving chip sovereignty and knowing that the EU needs to invest in its own companies and its own research institutes to propel the entire industry forward. And at the same time, the danger, at least perceived danger from the EU's side of kind of losing in the global race and ensuring that some protectionist measures are in place to protect the EU developments, which you can argue is either good or bad, but it's definitely a tension that exists there. And you can see it with the CHIPS Act, for example, and how it's trying to protect the European industry. That was very insightful. Thank you for those comments. I wanted maybe to move slightly more towards the aspects of education and skills gap that I think are crucial here as well, because we kind of cursorily touched on those in your comments. But I was just curious to know, as representatives from across the value chain and across the different sides of the industry, do you foresee a solution in the short or long term in how we use open silicon to educate the future generations of engineers and developers? Matthias?
Yeah, I think the solution is already available, or let's say we witnessed in the last 2 years or 3 years a dramatic change in the ecosystem, in the education ecosystem, because of the availability of open source PDKs and open source designs, the Skywater shuttles, or the Google shuttles, things like that. So I think this will continue, and we will, let's say, the IHP PDK, for example, will enhance this ecosystem, and together with open source EDA tools that, by the way, benefit from this development because they can be enhanced, improved, and further developed using the examples that stem from these activities. This will create a huge momentum, or it already has some huge momentum. And I think this is something we need to harvest the results from. That's, well, I guess we are on a good track here. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, in my opinion, I think we have a lot of tools available in the open source ecosystem, but we need more critical mass, in this case students, to be part of to create those engineers for the, not for the present, because we are lack of engineers, at least on the hardware side, or on the hardware, because the software, it's more visible. I think people, students or young generations, are very aware of the potential, for example, of AI, or so software is more accessible, but at least in Spain, you can say, hardware is less attractive, let's say. So we need to make that more visible to the young generations and make the way of making it attractive for them. So having, I don't know, master degrees or some courses very specialized on the design flow with practical cases, showing how important it is to make that happen, actually, because otherwise they cannot run any of those software and applications that they really like. I think that's very important, and it will take some time. So we need to organize all those open source tools and in a way that can be managed by professors and incorporate those into the universities. And perhaps some of my colleagues have a better view of this, and they know better than me, but that's my perception of this.
Okay. If I can call on Luca, because I completely, because of your screen being blacked out, I forgot that you're here. A lot of those points that were just mentioned about the attractiveness of open hardware and kind of hardware engineering, about the issues with access to licenses and academia. You touched on a lot of these in the roadmap that you created at the Free Silicon Foundation on the open silicon. So if you want to kind of speak up and present some of your thoughts, maybe, because I feel like a lot of the issues that we just discussed kind of fit into what you presented in that paper.
Thanks, Ola, and apologies for not too many. Indeed, my screen is blanked and I can't see your slides either, so maybe that's a bit harder. Yes, we touched many of these points in the roadmap that is online, is available for download for everybody. Maybe a few comments, maybe starting from the last one. So about education, as Matthias already said, we have seen quite some change happening already. So there are fantastic examples across Europe, and names are available in the roadmap as well of people jumping on open source and making open source chip designs and using open source PDKs, those which are available. But I also think we should not think it's so easy. I would say it's pretty difficult. It's difficult when you live in a world where, if you think at the counterpart, for kids going, to school, 10 years old, they used to use Microsoft to get Macs for learning. In a world like this, it's difficult to develop open source. And in the EDA, in the chip design ecosystem, people are constantly under this education pressure of Euro practice, which basically gives them, I like to call it, make the metaphor with drugs. They give them the first cocaine dose for free, and then they're addicted for the rest of their life. And apologies for the horrible parallelism, but that's pretty much how it is. And I think many professors are a bit reluctant to jump on this parallel track. First, because they are used to teach cadence and synopsis. And second, because they think the industry needs cadence and synopsis engineers, and that's correct. But third, also because of the culture. If you're used to that proprietary ecosystem, you have a different mindset. And I think we need to work on this as well. And it's a bit a loop, because if the industry is used to these proprietary tools, then of course you need to produce the students. And I think that Europe could, and that's also written in the roadmap, to create or kickstart some needs for open source tools. For example, mandate that the identity cards are open source, completely open source, open source silicon, so you can download the layout. And that would mandate designing using open source tools. And that would mandate, therefore, the students learning this, and would mandate professors who teach these classes. So I think it's not an easy task. And I think there is a lot which needs to happen. And also, another comment is, I would like that, I feel at the moment there is a little bit too much optimism about open source silicon. And I'd like to cite a case which happened a few years ago in Bern, in Switzerland. There was a group of people who decided to make open source education, so basically using LibreOffice, using Doodle, Etherpad, and all these open tools. And they decided to try it out, but this created giant expectations. Teachers were not ready to use these tools. There were lots of bugs and problems, and this created a big revolt against it, and now everybody's back to using Microsoft and Macs. I'm a bit afraid that this may happen now. So I'd like to just point out very clearly that the EDA tools at the moment are not very usable. They're pretty bad, I would say, even. Certainly not compatible with the usability of Cadence and Synopsys. We're very far from it. So I don't want people to get too much expectations. Again, we need, as many others said already, we need to invest much more money into this. And I think that EDA is a little bit like roads, public roads. You know, it's a service. It's there. And once you have roads, you can take your car and travel from one city to the other. Open source EDA tools should be something like roads. It's a basic infrastructure. And we're not there yet to have a good infrastructure. We have bumpy roads, we have off-road roads. It's pretty horrible in the open source domain, but it can be done and needs more investment in this direction. So maybe these are the main comments I had so far.
Thank you for that. Matthias, do you want to?
I would like to comment that also using commercial EDA tools is a bumpy road. So EDA in general is bumpy.
Okay, maybe the dream could be to have a kind of open source framework, the general framework, where we could have some private plugins and open source plugins that could fit into it. So I take the analogy with Eclipse for software development, which is really a great tool. It was initially created by IBM, but then turned into open source solution. And it's really a great tool that enables many software developments. So having a global framework that would be supported by the whole community, where some private, such as Cadence, Synopsys, that has been mentioned, could have their role, would be really something great. But I think it's a dream at this stage. We're a bit far from that.
Yes, do you want to add anything?
I feel like I'm talking too much. Okay, but what I'm missing in this discussion is also open source as a business model, because I basically think that's often not seen. But if you look at Linux, for example, you can buy Red Hat Linux for a lot of money, which is eventually open source. But you buy the things like certification or support, maintenance, things like that. And I'm not seeing that happening in open source EDA, or maybe it could also be present in open source silicon. Because like if you have something like an open source IP block, you could still buy integration services or things like that.
I mean,
and
that's
maybe by the security that has been mentioned by Philip, for instance, because when you use IP, you need the security, and this could be a part of the business model, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah.
That is basically what the companies like at Micro do, and of course, even though you might find a lot of interesting things online, it's not that you're going to find stuff on GitHub and put it in your chip, or find tools and just kind of out of the blue decide to use them. There's a certain learning curve involved, and kind of diminishing that learning curve. I mean, it diminishes a little bit on its own, because open source tends to kind of, at least successful open source tends to get easier and easier to use. But of course, like the cost of adoption never goes down to zero, and that delta can become a profitable business model. And that has been shown in other areas too. And of course, it's different for tools, it's different for IP, and there's also different models. It's not even one model. Like we do services, that's kind of our way of doing things. But there are other people who, they might sell prepackaged IP. Sci-Fi is a good example, where at least for a long time, a lot of their IP was kind of based on open source, but they would, like package it and sell it eventually for large sums of money, right? It's not free at all. They provide you with the certainty that whatever they give you will actually work. So that, there's plenty of business of open source. I mean, perhaps not in the hardware space yet. I mean, not as much as in other areas, but certainly there's money to be made. Because again, open source is probably super for innovation, for education, for lots of different things that are harder to do with proprietary stuff. But it doesn't like oppose business. If anything, actually, business entities can embrace open source to leverage the position they already have in the market, and go further and deeper with open source than they normally could. So I totally agree with Matthias, where it's an important aspect of the conversation that perhaps we didn't touch upon yet a lot. And it's also okay that other people don't embrace open source. And there's companies that, never touch open source. That's like open source doesn't try to get into every nook and cranny of everything. It's more trying to see where's the opportunity that has been missed by other people. And that's, I think, where it is the most efficient. And in the hardware space, I think there's plenty of things that haven't been addressed. I mean, many people that we talk to say, we'd like to do X, Y, Z, but we cannot because it falls outside of the scope of interest of the traditional flows and tools and IPs and so on. And there's plenty of reuse of different kinds of IP, like, I don't know, PCI Express or DDR controllers, or, many, many things that could potentially be based on open source to everyone's benefit. So I just want to say that it's a very nuanced conversation, and there are some areas where open source is very hard, like a complete open source end-to-end ASIC flow. It exists, OpenRoad exists, but there's a long way to go before you can say, oh, it's a replacement, right? But there are many other areas in which catch up is not as difficult, and there are some tools like Verilator that are already very, very successful today, and a lot of people use them. And we help support like commercial adoption of things like Verilator. And of course, there are other areas where, like there's nothing. Stuff has to be built from scratch pretty much.
So maybe moving slightly further away from this conversation, and going into open standards and the issue of standards in open silicon, and the attempts at, as you mentioned, like the legal issues that come up when dealing with IP. How do European companies, if at all, cooperate with standardization bodies, and how do they approach the issues in the legal and administrative space now? Any takers?
That's a complex question. Yes, we have to cooperate for sure when it makes sense, when it is in our business. For instance, speaking for Eviden, Eviden is cooperating and is part of the Ultra Ethernet consortium. So it's not an official standard; it's a de facto standard pushed by a closed group. But and I can add that it's even the only non-European company that is part of this body. So it's interesting, and it's important for our business. But it is only possible when you are really something to, as I mentioned earlier, to bring in the discussion, to bring on the table, that you're good enough to be in this group. So it's not an easy task, and it's still ongoing discussions. But it is doable, and it is quite important when we have some strong business behind that, as it is the case for Eviden with the interconnect needed for supercomputers. But so it is of course a case-by-case thing, and it's really depends on the business and on the value you can bring there in those discussions.
Absolutely. Are there any, I don't really know how to phrase this, but you have mentioned multiple times throughout this discussion that there are still some areas for improvement, and there are still some elements that are missing from ensuring that the industry can fully flourish, and open silicon can kind of find those nooks and crannies where it actually fits and be useful there. Do you see a role of the EU and EU-funded projects in identifying those gaps and elevating them? Or do you think that maybe broader international cooperation is needed to address those issues?
The EU certainly plays a role, and it's already doing that. We have a number of like industry bodies where we're meeting, discussing those gaps, and there's a number of projects that have been launched, like Tristan and Isolde on the EU level, trying to address some of these gaps. So certainly there's a role for the EU to play, but also, of course, like we can't have the megalomania to claim that, you know, like the EU is going to solve all the world's problems. There needs to be collaboration on an international level, which is already happening. I mean, like RISC-V, for example, is a completely global initiative, as it should be. But I believe that the EU has definitely a big role to play in terms of like establishing good standards and providing some kind of, you know, especially like legal support and all these things. I don't think it's doing a particularly good job yet, right? Like, I mean, I know there's a lot of people involved and everyone's trying to do the right thing, but of course it's a drop in the ocean in terms of what the EU could be doing potentially. One thing that always comes to my mind is that, you know, it's very easy to encourage open source development with EU funding, for example. You just do projects and you say, hey, look, you're going to get money. Whatever you do is going to be open source. And, you know, very simple proposition, very kind of powerful message. And I mean, I'm not even saying that all the projects should be like that, although the extreme case could argue for this, like it's public money, perhaps it should just be open. But let's say it's even a subset of you know, kind of specialized funding to encourage people to, you know, okay, you have to build something, but you have to build it in the open. It doesn't mean you make it GPL. I mean, I don't think that would be a good idea. But you make it, you know, Apache licensed or whatever kind of permissive, business-friendly license you want to use, and then, you know, people would naturally go and say, well, okay, I can get money to do open source. Makes sense. Let's try this, right? And it definitely wouldn't solve all the problems, right? It's just an element in a broader strategy that's needed. But I think there are things that you could do. That's perhaps just what I'm saying. I don't have all the answers, like what exactly should be done, but there's a role to play there for sure, especially to encourage stuff like education, for example. This is a very central area where, you know, public money has a role to play, right?
It was a tricky question because this is a European Commission branded event, so whatever you say will be taken against you. I'm kidding. But it's an important conversation to be had, and it's vital that we kind of bring up also the less exciting and sexy topics into the light and bring out the spaces that still need to be fixed in the process. We are running out of time slowly but surely, and I was just interested. Some of the comments that you made in the panel kind of prompt me to ask you about just taking the temperature and seeing what do you think about the future of open silicon, how enthusiastic or unenthusiastic you are. I've seen some and heard some comments that kind of point to the opposite. So yeah, what are your kind of outlooks as the stakeholders and actors in this space for, let's say, the next 10 years? How do you see this unraveling? No comment.
Maybe I can start. So I would say confident in the long term. So for me, it's a long-term story, and we have to think on the long term. So I'm pretty confident on the long term. On the short term, when you are in a race with stakeholders such as NVIDIA, Intel, etc., that brings mature chips quickly to the market, you cannot wait too long, and you have to find some early solutions. But on the long term, and for me, clearly it's an enabler. We have to push to have more open source in our global solutions. It cannot be a global goal, I would say. We cannot imagine to have everything open source, and it cannot be a Graal or something absolute. But we have to push for more openness and more open source in our solutions.
maybe I could
agree with Etienne. So
okay, maybe I take the word next. Well, of course, I would say by definition very optimistic here because that's basically what I'm trying to do with the foundation, with the Free Silicon Foundation. But I'm also nervous in the sense that there are risks. If wrong decisions are taken, a lot of damage can be made. And it's certainly not going to be something for Philippe, not that we have here in a sense. It's not going to be tackling 3 nanometers for sure, not for a long time. I hope on the long run it will, but certainly not on the short term. So we're going to tackling older nodes, mature nodes, simple chips, like an identity card. And there is a dramatic amount of innovation which can be done with, I think, a tiny investment compared to the entire CHIPS Act budget. But again, right decisions need to be made and not commit mistakes.
So coolly optimistic.
Yeah.
Teresa?
Well, I'm optimistic. I think open source is the way to go. But also we have to be cautious on this. So we have to progress step by step and be sure that we create a good foundational and good basis to grow on top of that. You know, because otherwise we can work on fragmentation. So like we open a lot of fronts in many areas. So we have to grow organically and step by step. So short term, we are making progress, we are learning, we have to adapt or to be early adopters, let's say. But in the long way, I think we might, I'm optimistic on that. And we are pushing on that too. So that's good.
Yeah, you have skin in the game. You need to say that. Philippe, do you have an input here?
Yeah, I guess we are almost aligned, and especially if we take the example of advanced compute and 3 nanometer, there are multiple points behind. So looking for performances, you need the best tools. And today we have no choice. It tends to, let's say, Synopsys and Cadence. And as you said, so even if we are recruiting juniors, so we don't care which tools they used at school, open, Euro practice, or let's say private tools, we train on the tools we have, because that's not something we can negotiate. So we need the best tools, we need warranties. In 3 nanometer, for instance, it's linked to what has been discussed at the beginning in terms of open PDK. You cannot imagine how complex it is to have a TSMC PDK in 3 nanometer. They are so paranoid in terms of information leakage to Samsung or to China. I don't see how this could become open. So I'm not talking in behalf of TSMC, but I know all the complexity behind. And another example, for instance, in 3 nanometer, what we are, let's say, designing, it's talking about standard interface PCI generation 6. You could imagine that PCI controller becomes an open source. It could be even sponsored by EU. Okay, let's build an open source project to develop a PCI controller. By the way, the last PCI company in Europe, PLDA, has been sold to US. So it's gone. But let's imagine that we sponsor such a project. It's an open interface. Why not? Most of us around the table, we need PCI sooner or later. But when you have to license it, at the end, what makes the cost of the license the PHY, so the physical interface. So if you pay, let's say, 1 or 2 million to have access to a 3 nanometer PHY for PCI, you have the controller for free. So what's the interest in this case of building a controller? Because at the end, you know that in all cases, you don't pay for it. You have to pay for the PHY. I will be happy to say to find some, let's say, open hardware and 3 nanometer PHY using a TSMC and 3P, but I don't think it's realistic at this stage. So let's say for the next 10 years, I don't think it's going to change anything.
Fair enough. But yeah.
So sorry to be blunt on this.
Yeah, no, it's I'm not that pessimistic. I personally think that open source silicon and EDA is at the level where Linux was like 25 years ago, when Microsoft was dominant. I think we see, I mean, I know the industry perspective a little myself, but I see a certain mind shift happening. I mean, it's more a mood shift, not a mind shift. but people start considering open source EDA and maybe also silicon an alternative worth looking at. And now we also see a generation of designers entering the job market that have been educated with Skywater, PDKs and things like that. They come also with a mindset shift. I think that's a gradual process. It will take some time, and it will sure not be 3 nanometer where this will happen. So, but I think it's just a matter of time until this gets more momentum, and then we will see something like business models popping up for closing the adoption gap and leading to a better adoption of these solutions. That's my belief. And I also believe that the EU has a strong position to be a game changer in this play.
All right. I guess that's it. Thank you so much for the participation. Thank you for the participants who stayed on with us until the very end. I guess the one big takeaway is there is still a long way to go for the open silicon space to be fully mature. But we have things to look forward to and projects that are making exciting progress in the space. And we can utilize them for education and closing the skills gap. So we have things to look forward to. I think that's it from my side. I don't know if Diego wants to jump in just for the end here. But yeah, there he is. Do you want to unmute yourself? Okay. You're still on mute. Or your mic is off.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
perfect. Apologies for that. Just again, a small note to thank everyone for being here. This was a smaller event, but good to see that there was still interest from different areas of Europe. So we prepared just a small infographic to show where the participants are coming from. And thank you all for being here. We have a lot more work focused both on the policy and industry on the website, so please check that out. And just a note to say that the event recording and all the relevant information will be uploaded to the event page. So thank you again. And Olaf, there really is nothing else to say. Then thank you all for participating, and have a nice lunch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.